Hello, I'm Yigal Schleifer, and I am the co-founder of Culinary Backstreets, the global guide to local eats, a website that covers the local and neighborhood food scene in about 12, 13, 14 different cities around the world, including Mexico City. This website got its start originally in about 2009 when I was living in Istanbul and working in Istanbul as a journalist. And a friend and I started what was originally a blog about where to eat in Istanbul and where to eat sort of locally and authentically. And we really got interested in doing something like this because we had been reading so many articles about tourism articles about Istanbul, and often they were writing about very touristy places or very predictable places. And we thought, this is an incredible city with an incredible food culture, with an incredible neighborhood culture, and so many stories to tell through its food. So somebody should really be documenting that. So it really kind of started off as almost like an oral history of the city, but through the food or through the people making the food. So we really just started this blog writing about the places that we like to eat at, which are just very small neighborhood places, oftentimes places that had been several generations, in the same family, doing things that were very traditional or, kind of very, very local. And then at a certain point, we wrote a guidebook based on the material that we collected, and then we also started doing food walks. And the idea was for the walks to be sort of an extension of the editorial work, the writing that we were doing, so to also tell a story, and especially about neighborhoods that were off the tourist map. So that, to really help people discover parts of the city that were a little bit unknown, even to locals sometimes, and to really help to tell a bigger story. So it could be about history or about gentrification or about urban development or some kind of interesting subject that is specific to that neighborhood, but really to use the food to tell a story and to walk along and really learn. So that is, we started doing that, and that really took off. And then in 2012, we decided to take this model, which was this combination of having an editorial side and also doing tours, and take it to other cities around the world. So over time, we've added cities, including Mexico City, and it's been for us, a lot of fun. But it's also taken off in a nice way. People have really responded very well because I think a lot of people want to explore cities now this way through the food, but also kind of to find local and authentic places to eat and to also discover neighborhoods that are not touristy, and it's been great, a lot of fun for us to do. As a journalist, what I brought to the blog is the same thing that I brought to everything else that I wrote and reported on, which is accuracy, make it interesting, tell a good story, investigate, even if we're writing about food. And the truth is, I said, even though this is a quote-unquote food site, it's really a people site. We're really interested in the stories of the people making the food. I mean, the food is interesting and it's important and people want to eat good food. But what we're really interested in doing is telling the story of the people behind the food, and telling then the story of the neighborhoods behind the people. So to tell a story, be it a blog or be it a newspaper or a magazine, it's the same skills are required to do it well. I grew up in Israel as a kid. I was born in the United States, and when I was 3, my family moved to Israel. And I lived in Israel through the end of 3rd grade. So for a good chunk of my childhood. And as a kid in Istanbul, and a kid in Tel Aviv is where we lived, near the school that I went to, actually was in Ramat Aviv, there was a falafel place, little stand, basically, a kind of tiny little shop of falafel. If I remember correctly, it was run by a Yemenite guy. And, we would go in and, we had a few grushim, as we would call it then, like then I think we were using liras in Israel. Anyways, we had a little bit of money and we would get, a pita stuffed with falafel, and there was so much flavor there. There was, tahina to put on top, and also usually ambar, which was a kind of a mango chutney, really, just a lot of flavor. And then my family moved from Israel to Florida, Central Florida, and which was quite a shock because I went from a place, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, many different cultures, different languages, to, Central Florida, fairly monoculture. And certainly in terms of food, nothing like that falafel place, in terms of flavor and kind of that feeling of a small neighborhood place run by a real, kind of local individual. And in a certain way, I feel like, my life has in many ways been about sort of reclaiming that lost or finding that lost falafel stand, in the sense of the stories behind the food, how flavor kind of brings us to life, how different cultures create food, how we can kind of explore a city through food, the kind of memories that food gives us. So yeah, so that thinking back to kind of that falafel place and in a certain way the kind of shock of leaving Israel and moving to Florida, and then sort of trying to reclaim maybe something that I lost. And there was one place that I ran into or found on this visit, which is just called Albert's House of Schnitzel, and it's just a place that makes schnitzel in a pita, with French fries and hummus, and it was like just so good. They made it so well, and that's the kind of things I really love in many places, Istanbul as well. There's oftentimes, and Mexico City, I find this as well, places that do just one thing, and that's what they do. And they do it really well, and people know that they do it really well, and they've been doing this one thing for generations, and people come for that one thing. And there's something so wonderful about the idea of, a one-dish place. If anyone goes to Tel Aviv, I highly recommend Albert's House of Schnitzel. Jewish life revolves around family, as it does with many other cultures. It revolves around holidays, or at least it used to for many people. And food is always, the kind of thing that brings you together, right? I mean, to sit down and eat. I think for a lot of Jews, especially kind of, in previous years in Europe and also parts of North Africa and Middle East, food was just a way of, of kind of getting through difficult times. It was just a way of bringing joy and happiness when that was often in short supply. So, and I think, food is just is a source of joy. And many Jews, were kind of hybrid people in terms of we come from many different cultures, right? My father was born in Romania. My mother was born in Switzerland, but grew up in Belgium. I was born in the United States, but spent part of my childhood in Israel. My own kids were born in Istanbul. My wife is from Canada. It's like, and it's I think that is a very Jewish story. And a lot of Jewish food in many ways, is sort of reflective of the different cultures that Jews have been part of. And falafel is a great example of that. So gefilte fish is an interesting subject, and I'm happy to talk about it. There's, I think it's a misunderstood thing. The problem is that the conception that most people have of gefilte fish is what comes out of a jar, and the kind of with the jelly and I, in recent years, have found these sort of frozen logs that you reheat, boil with carrots and onion, and I find those very tasty. I tried making my own homemade version that I think turned out really well. And I think it used to be the kind of food that mothers and grandmothers would make. And my father talks about, the carp in the bathtub on Fridays, before Shabbat, and then of course somebody would kill the carp, knock its head in, and then make the fish fresh, right? So I think gefilte fish is the kind of thing. It's a lot of work, and I think when it used to be homemade, it probably was incredibly delicious. Then, as we sort of in the 20th century moved towards more commercialized, industrialized food, industrialized or industrial gefilte fish is just not something you really want to eat. But I think artisanal gefilte fish, and artisanal is what used to be the regular thing, which was just regular homemade gefilte fish that probably my grandmother used to make. I think that's quite good. So I think gefilte fish gets an unfair rap because of what's happened to it in terms of industrialization. My approach to food, like I said, is really kind of people. It's almost like I'd say, wow, there's a kind of food maker who I've never met who I'd actually like to meet, versus like, oh, there's a kind of food that, yeah, I'd like to try. That's sort of my own approach. My experience with the Mexican food that I've encountered in my visits here is that sometimes it can be a bit on the heavier side. And the Lebanese way of eating, especially with meze, has a kind of lighter, at least the initial, sort of starting, then it heads. But if you kind of just do a kind of plate of meze, there is a kind of almost lighter feeling, sort of the more Mediterranean style of eating. But on the other hand, there's where the similarity is you kind of have these, both are very deep cultures, very deep food cultures, right? That go back, thousands of years, and these foods have developed over a very long period of time, and they're really very ingrained into life. So the food is not just about eating, but it's about living and about family and tradition. There's a certain way of eating that is kind of expected and understood. So I think Mexican. In many ways, Mexican flavors to me feel like they come from an even deeper origin. A lot of the sort of pre-Columbian flavors, to me, they seem sort of very almost deeper than some of the Middle Eastern flavors. But again, you have a lot of the same herbs that come through. Tomato, which is such an important part of Mediterranean cuisine now, comes from here. It's actually in a certain way a new thing relatively. So I don't know. It's interesting. I think, but in a way, they converge. But I think in many ways they seem quite different to me. Something that I find very interesting, and something that we're really trying to promote through the work that Culinary Backstreets does, is the idea of the importance of healthy neighborhoods in having a healthy city overall. Sort of this ecosystem where without healthy neighborhoods, we won't have a healthy city. And then how food places, restaurants, bodegas, little bars, markets, other food makers, play a very important role in maintaining the health of the neighborhood. And, when we talk about city life, we often look at things like infrastructure, public transport, housing, parks, all things that make a lot of sense. But I think we oftentimes don't look at food places as part of the urban landscape and the role that they play, and we kind of take them for granted, like, oh, of course the restaurant's always been there, it'll always be there, or it's just a place to go get food to eat, and what we're trying to say is no, actually, these are important and crucial parts of city life and of healthy city life, and the restaurant is a gathering place for the neighborhood, feeding people, but also serving as a kind of meeting spot and a place that helps a neighborhood develop. Without a restaurant, it's hard for certain neighborhoods to develop, or if a neighborhood's been around there for forever, it keeps a kind of stability in the neighborhood. So there's something very important about food places that I feel is oftentimes ignored, and what we're trying to do through the work that we do, both the editorial side and also through the food tours that we do, is really highlight, shine a spotlight on these little neighborhood spots that have been doing this important work for so long, to talk about the idea of how we need to support them and maybe bring a new audience to them, because sometimes with gentrification or urban development, these little spots become endangered. I think what we're really trying to promote is this idea of the food, the food places, the restaurants and the little bars and the little markets and other little food makers just being really important parts in this bigger picture of what makes a healthy city, a livable city. For me, Mexico City is a really incredible place, for this kind of work that we're doing. It's such a large city with so many neighborhoods and such a healthy neighborhood life. It still feels like it's a place where you do have these very distinct neighborhoods with their very distinct little neighborhood spots, and food is such an important part of life here in a way that I haven't seen many other places, in the sense that sort of the rhythm of the day seems to be kind of defined by the kind of food that you find, so in the morning you find this, and in the afternoon you find that, and some places are only open between this hour and that hour, and it's very different than many other places that I've been in. So it's really interesting to experience that and watch that, and sort of see that there's a lot of small scale food production going on here, in a way that you certainly don't see in the United States and other European cities in many ways, and even in the Middle East. So it's quite an inspiring place in many ways.